There is a 60-minute gap in the Tonight Show archives that the network tried to scrub from existence for over 40 years. It was the night Johnny Carson intentionally sabotaged his own broadcast, proving that the most powerful thing he ever said was the silence he forced upon a nation. The evening started like any other at Studio One. The air was thick with the scent of hairspray and expensive cologne, the brass section of the band warming up with that familiar, electric energy that always preceded a taping. To the casual observer, everything was perfect. The polished mahogany of the desk gleaming under the high-wattage rafters. The audience was settled, their faces glowing with anticipation. But behind the curtain, in the narrow hallway leading to the stage, the atmosphere was fractured and tense. Ed McMahon, the towering voice of a generation, was leaning against a cold concrete wall, his breathing shallow and his face a shade of gray that no makeup artist could mask. He looked like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, painful road, a man whose strength had finally been outpaced by a sorrow that knew no bounds. Johnny Carson stood just a few feet away, adjusting his cuffs with practiced precision, but his eyes never left his partner. He didn't see the jovial announcer. He saw a brother crumbling under the weight of a private passing of the spirit. There was a secret burden Ed was carrying that night, a heavy grief that had slowed his heart and clouded his mind. When the music started and the announcer's voice rang out, "Here's Johnny," it lacked its signature thunder. As Johnny stepped through the curtains, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the shadows where Ed sat, and he saw the way his friend's spirit was wavering, as if drifting toward a shore where no one could follow, a place where the laughter of the world couldn't reach him no matter how hard the band played. The monologue began, but the rhythm was off. Johnny was stalling, his eyes darting toward the desk more often than usual, his mind clearly elsewhere. He was watching the monitor, watching the sweat bead on Ed's forehead, knowing his best friend was going to break in front of 20 million people. The producers in the booth were already whispering, sensing the tension, their fingers hovering over buttons that would zoom in on the tragedy for the sake of a viral moment. They wanted the drama. They wanted the spectacle of a legend falling apart. But Johnny Carson had lived his entire life in the spotlight, and he knew how cruel that light could be when you have nowhere left to hide. When every emotion is magnified for a public that doesn't always understand the cost of a smile, the tension became a physical weight, making the laughter feel thin and artificial, like a recording played too slow. Johnny stopped mid-sentence, shifting his gaze from the lens to the darkened booth where the directors sat in judgment. He realized that if he didn't act within seconds, the world would witness a humiliation Ed would never recover from. With a look of fierce, protective loyalty, Johnny did the unthinkable and signaled for the master switch to be pulled. The transition was so abrupt it felt like a heartbeat skipping, leaving a vacuum of sound where the laughter of a nation used to live. It was a daring act of professional defiance that left the network executives breathless and the viewers at home staring into a black void, wondering if the world had ended. Ed was not himself that Tuesday. The booming "Here's Johnny" had a hollow ring that only a best friend could detect. To millions at home, it might have sounded like a slight cold, but to Johnny, it sounded like a cry for help from the bottom of a well. The man who had been the heartbeat of late night was suddenly out of rhythm, his armor showing cracks that threatened to spill out a lifetime of hidden sorrow. The internal battle was raging behind those famous eyes, a fight against a tide of memories that refused to stay buried, a struggle to maintain the persona that America had grown to love, even as his own world was collapsing around him. The trouble began long before the stage lights warmed up. For weeks, Ed had been carrying a quiet, heavy stone, a private family tragedy he refused to speak of, fearing it would diminish the joy he brought to the world. He arrived at the studio 3 hours early, sitting in his dressing room with the lights off, staring at a photograph of his family until his eyes burned. He tried to splash cold water on his face, trying to find that old spark, but the well was dry. By the time he walked toward the curtain, his legs felt like lead, and his mind was a fog of grief that no amount of professional training could clear, a fog that grew thicker with every second that passed. If you believe that legends like Johnny and Ed deserve to have their true stories told with the dignity they earned, hit that subscribe button. Join our community as we pull back the curtain on the most heart-wrenching, hidden moments in Hollywood history. When the show began, the cracks were impossible to ignore. During the monologue, Ed missed his cue for the first time in memory. He laughed at a joke with no punchline and remained silent when Johnny set him up for banter. The audience began to shift, sensing that the man on stage was no longer in control. People in the front row whispered, noticing the way Ed struggled to find his place. He looked smaller than usual, as if the air in the room was crushing his broad shoulders. He was a giant who had realized he was made of glass, and the spotlight was beginning to make him shatter into 1,000 pieces right before the eyes of the people he loved most. Johnny watched from the corner of his eye, his heart aching for the man who had caught every one of his falls for 30 years. He tried to throw Ed a lifeline, but Ed only stared back with eyes that were glassy and unfocused. It was the look of a man who had lost his place in the story of his own life. Every second felt like a minute, and every stumble felt like a step closer to a permanent professional termination. Johnny knew the control booth saw it too, and unlike him, they were looking at Ed as a liability rather than a legend who deserved their grace and their patience. In network television, there is little room for a broken heart on display. Johnny could feel the invisible eyes of executives in New York, their pens poised to strike a line through a legend's name. As the second segment began, a production assistant hurried toward the director with a folded note. It was a message from the highest level of the network, and the words inside were as cold as ice, reflecting a world that valued profit over people and ratings over relationships. High above the lights of Times Square, an executive sat in a mahogany office, holding a memo that carried the weight of a guillotine. To him, Ed McMahon was no longer the beloved companion of America's midnight hour. He was a failing asset whose time had run out. The executive sneered at the monitor, telling his assistant that Ed was obsolete hardware in a premium time slot, a sentiment that ignored decades of service and a friendship that had helped build the very network he managed. The memo stated that if the announcer could not maintain his professional composure by the end of the week, he would be replaced before the Monday morning taping. They called it a necessary evolution, but it was a betrayal of the highest order. The executive placed a call to the booth in Burbank. He didn't ask about Ed's well-being. He simply ordered the cameras to stay tight on Ed's face if he faltered. "Capture every tear," he commanded. They were ready to sacrifice a man's legacy for one night of sensationalism, hoping for a moment that would boost their standings in the morning news. Back on stage, the air felt thinner. Johnny saw the executive producer, Fred de Cordova, hovering in the wings with grim concern. Fred whispered the ultimatum from the corporate suites. He told Johnny the suits were looking for any excuse to pull the plug on Ed's career. Johnny's jaw tightened, his composure masking a protective rage. He looked at Ed, who was staring into his empty mug. His spirit fractured. Johnny knew his friend was on the edge of a precipice, and the people he worked for were preparing to give him a push into the unknown without a second thought. Johnny realized his brother in everything but blood was being treated like a broken piece of equipment. He looked at the red light on the camera, then at the shadowy figures in the wings. He wasn't just a host anymore. He was a sentry guarding the soul of his friend. He had to choose between network rules and the laws of friendship. The producer tried to catch Johnny's eye, but Johnny turned away, focused entirely on the fragile man in the armchair next to him, a man who had given everything to a medium that was now turning its back on him in his hour of greatest need. The countdown to the next segment began, and the pressure reached a boiling point. Johnny could feel the predatory gaze of the lenses, waiting for the moment the giant finally fell. But as the red light flared to life once more, Johnny saw something in the monitor that made his blood run cold. It was the beginning of a total emotional collapse that no one was prepared to witness, a raw moment of truth in a world built on artifice and manufactured smiles. It happened during the second guest segment, a moment of profound confusion that curdled into a terrifying silence. The bright studio lights felt like the harsh glare of an interrogation room, exposing every line of grief on Ed's face. For 30 years, Ed had been the rock, but in this heartbeat, the rock began to crumble into dust. The guest, a young starlet, turned to Ed, expecting a supportive chuckle, but was met with a hollow stare. Ed opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a ragged intake of breath. He looked down at his notes, but the ink appeared to be swimming across the page, blurred by the tears he could no longer suppress. He tried to adjust his tie, his hands shaking so violently he nearly knocked over his glass. The professional mask shattered. He looked at Johnny with a panicked, silent plea, reaching out for a hand that felt 1,000 miles away, a man adrift in his own sorrow. The camera, following cold instructions, didn't pull away. Instead, it zoomed in, capturing the raw moisture in Ed's eyes as he fought a losing battle with his own heart. A pin could be heard dropping. The audience sat in paralyzed shock, witnessing a legend reaching his breaking point. Ed's head bowed, and a single sob escaped his throat, a sound of such pure anguish that it made the room feel cold. He was a man drowning in a sea of private sorrow, and the world was invited to watch him sink without a lifeline or a word of comfort. Johnny could smell the salt of those tears. He saw the director signaling for the camera to move even closer to capture the final conclusion of a career in high definition. The network wanted to feast on Ed's dignity. Johnny looked at the red tally light, glowing like a predatory eye. He knew that in 5 seconds, Ed McMahon would be a punchline forever, unless someone had the courage to stop the world and protect what was left of his friend's pride. We've all had a moment where we felt the world was watching us stumble. Have you ever had a friend step in and cut the feed when you needed it most? Drop a comment below and tell us about the person who stood by you in your darkest hour. Let's honor those real-life heroes together. The silence grew so thick it felt like it would never break. Ed's shoulders were heaving, lost in the shadows of his own departing joy. Johnny Carson reached out and placed his hand firmly on Ed's arm, a gesture of ironclad loyalty that sent a shockwave through the control room. He didn't look at the guest, and he didn't look at the audience. He looked directly into the lens and made a decision that would defy every law of the industry, prioritizing a human soul over a broadcast and a friend over a career. Johnny didn't call for a commercial. He did something that violated every sacred rule. He looked into the eye of camera one and, with a voice that carried the weight of a thunderclap, he gave the order that would go down in history. "Cut the feed," he said, his eyes burning with protective fire. "Cut it right now." In the control booth, the director hesitated. To cut a live broadcast during peak hours was a professional violation, but Johnny didn't blink. He stared into that camera until the director felt the force of his will. Finally, a trembling finger hit the master switch. Across the United States, millions of screens suddenly went black. No explanation was given, just a vast, echoing void where the laughter of a nation used to live. Johnny had silenced the voice of late night to create a sanctuary of shadows for his brother. The studio fell into a different darkness. Stage lights dimmed. Johnny didn't stand up. He wrapped his arm around Ed's shaking shoulders, shielding his face from the prying eyes of the crew. For those first minutes, the only sound was the ragged sobbing of a man who had finally let go of a burden too heavy to carry alone. Ed's forehead rested against Johnny's shoulder, his tears soaking into Johnny's suit, but Johnny didn't care. He held him with the strength of a man holding back the tide, offering a quiet refuge in the middle of a perfect storm. The producers were frantic, headsets buzzing with screams from New York executives. They scurried around the edges of the stage, but didn't dare step into the circle of light where the two men sat. Johnny had drawn a line that no one had the courage to cross. He was using his legendary power to provide privacy to a man who had given his life to the public. In that silence, the king of late night was a sentry guarding the remains of a friend's dignity, standing tall against the pressures of an industry that never slept. As the minutes ticked by and the world wondered if the end had arrived, a different kind of peace settled over the stage. The raw grief began to soften into exhausted breathing. Johnny leaned in close to Ed's ear, telling his friend that the cameras were off, the world was gone, and they were finally alone in the dark. The famous stage became a sanctuary of whispers. Those floorboards held the weight of two men who had forgotten about the fame and the prestige. The Tonight Show stage was no longer a set. It was a sacred ground where a friendship was being forged into something eternal, far beyond the reach of the spotlight and the judgment of the public. Johnny pulled up a stool and sat directly in front of Ed, their knees almost touching in the dim glow. Ed spoke in a voice that was barely a thread of sound, confessing the secret eating him alive, the passing of his youngest brother, and the mounting debts from medical bills that had left him terrified and hollow. He told Johnny he felt like a fraud, a man paid to be happy when his soul was dressed in mourning clothes, a man who couldn't find the joy he so easily sold to others every single night. Johnny listened with unwavering intensity. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply gripped Ed's hand, a solid anchor. Johnny spoke of his own regrets, the lonely nights in Malibu, and the times he felt like the loneliest man in America despite the millions watching. He told Ed that the show was just a collection of lights and plywood, but the man in that chair was the only thing that made it real. For an hour, two legends stripped away their titles to reveal the hurting human beings underneath. Johnny promised that the tape of the breakdown would be erased before the sun came up, and his word was as good as law. That intimacy was something no camera could capture. Ed realized he wasn't just a sidekick. He was a brother, loved for who he was. Johnny's voice was a steady presence, assuring Ed that his chair would be there for as long as he wanted it, and no executive had the power to take it away. They were soldiers in the foxhole of fame, bonded by a night of shared vulnerability that would change them forever. As the clock ticked toward 2 a.m, the tension began to lift, replaced by a profound peace. Johnny walked toward the back of the stage and picked up the heavy red telephone. He dialed the direct line to the man who controlled the network, and his expression turned as sharp as a razor, ready to defend what was left of their collective dignity. If you believe true friendship is worth more than any career, please share this story with someone who has always stood by your side. Send them this video as a silent thank you for being your anchor in the storm. Johnny picked up the red phone, the one that went straight to the chairman in a penthouse thousands of miles away. It was the tool of a man playing games with human lives. The silence on the line was the sound of a powerful man waiting to be appeased, but Johnny offered a challenge that made the air turn to ice, a refusal to back down from the truth, no matter the consequences. The chairman crackled through the receiver, demanding to know why the most profitable hour had been replaced by a black screen. He spoke of lost revenue and of the unprofessional display from the announcer's chair. He was ready to let Ed go over the phone, but Johnny didn't let him finish. In a voice terrifyingly calm, Johnny put his own legendary career on the line like a poker chip. He told the chairman that if there was a whisper of a replacement for Ed, or if the suits tried to exploit a man's private heartbreak again, the show would end that very second, and the network would lose its greatest asset. "If Ed goes, I go tonight," Johnny said, and the finality in his tone was like the closing of a vault door. He made it clear he would walk out, taking the prestige of 3 decades with him. The power dynamic shifted instantly. The chairman realized he was facing a man who cared more about his brother than his crown. Johnny demanded job security for Ed and a promise that the footage of the breakdown would be permanently removed, never to be seen by human eyes again, a demand that left no room for debate or corporate spin. The negotiation was short because there was nothing left to negotiate. Johnny had stripped the network of its leverage by showing he couldn't be bullied. He was using his fame as a shield. When he finally hung up, he looked exhausted but resolute. Ed had been listening from the shadows, his face a mask of gratitude. Ed tried to protest, but Johnny simply shook his head. He told Ed that a kingdom was a very lonely place when you're the only person sitting on a throne, and he wasn't about to let his friend go. The bargain was struck in the middle of the night, a secret pact to preserve a man's dignity. Johnny had proven that the most powerful thing you can own is the courage to say no. But as they prepared to leave, Johnny realized a promise from a network executive was only worth the paper it was written on. He had to do something more, something that would anchor this night in reality forever. They walked out of the studio at 2 a.m, their shadows stretching across the empty lot, but the world would not know the truth for 40 years. To reporters at the gates, it was just a technical glitch. For 4 decades, the technicians kept their silence, sworn to a code money couldn't break. Behind the closed doors of their cars, a bond had been sealed deeper than any headline. Johnny and Ed drove away in a quiet procession, more connected than they had ever been in all their years together, and that bond never wavered. The official story given to the press was a masterpiece of Hollywood misdirection. The network blamed a catastrophic failure in the cooling system. It was a merciful lie. It transformed an emotional collapse into an engineering error, allowing Ed to return the next night with his chin held high. Johnny personally oversaw the scrubbing of the logs and the physical removal of the recording tapes. He watched as the magnetic strips were rendered unusable, ensuring Ed's tear-stained face would never be used as a cheap punchline in the years to come, long after they were gone. The protection didn't stop at the gates. Johnny quietly directed his accountants to set up a private endowment for Ed's family, a financial fortress that would absorb the staggering medical debts and the costs associated with the passing of Ed's brother. He did it through anonymous companies, so Ed would never feel the sting of charity or the weight of a debt he could never repay. Johnny knew the only way for Ed to find his laughter again was to remove the fear strangling it. He became the silent architect of Ed's recovery, a constant support in the background of his life. Their private pact became the foundation of their remaining years on the air. Every night at 11:30, there was a new depth in the way they looked at one another, a silent acknowledgement of the night the world went dark so a soul could stay bright. Johnny would often whisper a joke during commercial breaks, just to see that booming light return to his friend's face. He was a gardener tending to a spirit that had almost been put out, a friend who never forgot the weight of that Tuesday night or the power of silence. The public watched, unaware these two men were survivors of a storm. They saw the laughter, but not the incredible price Johnny had paid to keep those scars hidden from view. The years slipped away like sand through an hourglass, and as the final episode approached, the weight of that secret pulled at them once more. They knew that, when the curtain fell, the truth would be carried into the sunset by the only two men who lived through the silence, two friends who had shared the ultimate secret of television. Years later, during Johnny's final episode in 1992, the two men shared a look that said everything. The air was thick with nostalgia, but beneath the celebration lay the memory of that one Tuesday night. As the final minutes ticked away, Johnny's eyes were fixed on the man in the tuxedo who had stood by him through the deepest valleys, the man who had been his constant for 30 long years. The world saw two icons taking a final bow, but Johnny was seeing the man he rescued from the abyss. He remembered the weight of Ed's head on his shoulder. He realized that in all those years of fame, nothing meant more than the silence shared in the dark. Ed sat in his chair, his eyes glistening with a moisture he no longer had to hide. He wasn't crying because the show was ending. He was crying because he knew the heart of the man behind the desk. He knew Johnny was a brother who had risked his kingdom to save one friend from suffering, a king who chose his subject over his throne every single time. In the final commercial break, Ed placed a hand on Johnny's arm, mirroring the gesture from a decade earlier. He simply whispered, "I never forgot that you turned off the world for me, John." Johnny nodded once, a movement that held the weight of a lifetime. They both knew the most important thing they ever broadcast was the one thing the audience never saw, a moment of pure grace that allowed Ed to live with his head held high, knowing he was truly loved. The legacy of that night colored every show since. It was why Johnny became a little softer, more protective of those in the shadows. He had learned that bright lights often mask profound loneliness, and he made it his mission to look after those struggling to keep their own lights from flickering out. As they stood for the final ovation, the only sound they really heard was the echo of that quiet hour in the dark, a memory that would stay with them until the very end of their days. The final curtain fell, and the two men walked off stage together, their journey complete. But even as they entered retirement, there was one more chapter yet to be written. In the quiet years that followed, a discovery was made in a locked drawer in Johnny's study that would finally reveal the full extent of the sacrifice he had made, a testament to a friendship that knew no bounds and feared no judgment. We remember the jokes and the characters, but the black screen of that Tuesday night remains the most beautiful thing Johnny Carson ever broadcast. This was his greatest monologue, delivered without a word. In the end, the king of late night didn't define his legacy by stars, but by one friend he refused to let fall into the shadows of public heartbreak, a legacy of love rather than just laughter that would endure long after the sets were dismantled. When the world finally lost the man who had been its midnight companion in 2005, a small envelope was found in his private desk drawer. It was a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery in Ed McMahon's bold script. The ink was faded, but the words were vibrant and clear. It read, "Thank you for the darkness, John. It was the only place I could finally see the light." This revealed the truth. Johnny hadn't just saved a career. He had saved a man's soul by offering him the grace of being invisible when the world was watching. It was a reminder that the greatest acts of kindness are never captured by a camera lens, but are written in the hearts of those we help. This story teaches us a lesson that resonates far beyond the lights of Burbank. It reminds us that in a world obsessed with visibility, the most powerful thing we can offer is our presence in a dark hour. Johnny Carson realized fame meant nothing if he couldn't shield a brother from the cold. He showed us that loyalty is about holding someone's hand and turning off the lights when they are distressed. For 55 minutes, a nation stared at a black screen, seeing the silhouette of a true friend, an image that would endure longer than any television show or any piece of film. As we look back at those two chairs, we shouldn't just think of the laughter. We should think of the man willing to let his kingdom go silent to hear his friend breathe again. True success is about being the one person who knows when someone needs to be seen and when they need to be hidden. It is a story of brotherhood, a reminder that we are all just walking each other home through the night, regardless of who is watching or how high the ratings might be. Johnny once said that some of the most important people you meet aren't famous. He proved that even in the most competitive industry, love and loyalty have the final word. If this story reminded you of a friend who stayed by your side when your world went dark, then Johnny's final broadcast achieved exactly what he intended. Because the most important light in the room isn't the one on the camera, it is the one we keep burning for each other in the quiet, dark corners of our lives where no one else can see. If this story of unspoken loyalty touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. Everything helps us preserve these powerful, hidden moments of Hollywood history for a new generation to cherish. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of the human stories behind the legends. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important light we have is the one we hold for each other.